Good afternoon and welcome to the 180th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID 19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today we have a discussion of memorials with Paul Farber of the Monument Lab. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID Calls live every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can also watch COVID Calls on Facebook Live and on Periscope. You can hear COVID Calls anytime recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @USOfDisaster or @COVID Calls. Please do help spread the word, send suggestions for future guests and future topics, and please do feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, December 3rd, 2020, there are 1,501,076 deaths from COVID-19 globally. According to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center, there are 14,012,378 cases reported in the United States. There are now a total of 274,648 deaths reported in the United States from COVID-19. That's up from 271,347 reported yesterday. People in the United States yesterday died at approximately a rate of 2 per minute from COVID-19. As a way to bring some humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic in some way, and I'd like to continue that now. The headline is Bearing Witness, taken by COVID-19. Daria Vera's impassioned civil rights advocacy lives on by Francisco Guajardo. This appeared in The Monitor, November 1st. Daria Vera, a lifelong resident of Rio Grande City, died August 6th at 5:05 p.m. at the Baptist Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas. At 73, she succumbed to complications resulting from COVID-19. Daria's daughter, Maricela Olvera, bore close witness to her mother's life and tells that the hospital in Rio Grande City had simply run out of space to treat COVID-19 victims. So they flew my mother to the Baptist Hospital in San Antonio, and she died there, she said. It was very sad because we could only communicate with her through the computer. Daria was born on November 18, 1946, in Rio Grande City. She attended school up to the 3rd grade and at a young age began to work in agricultural fields in South Texas, and even followed the crops to the fields of West Texas. Her lack of formal education did not define her, however. Maricela describes her mother as a spark plug, a capable woman whose enormous talent was matched only by her immense passion. When Daria was 19, she worked as a melon picker, earning 40 cents an hour to pick cantaloupes, a wage much lower than what other laborers earned. Daria did not like that, and she did not like the fact that there were no bathrooms available to women working in the fields, nor was there running water or access to other basic laborer necessities. The United Farm Workers Organization, led by Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, was just gaining strength across the country, and it came to Daria's community to gauge interest in a strike to protest low wages and unacceptable working conditions. Daria threw herself into the organizing effort, assuming a leadership role in the famous melon strike of 1966 in Rio Grande City. This historic event pitted melon growers against the workers who picked the melons. To combat Daria and other strikers, the growers looked to bring in replacement workers from Mexico. When a bus with Mexican workers made its way across the international suspension bridge between Miguel Alemán, Tamaulipas, and Roma, Daria laid down on the bridge to block the oncoming bus filled with replacement workers. A photograph of Daria and another striker became the subject of national news. That photograph is, by the way, connected with this obituary, and I'll post that on Twitter after the program today. According to historian Maritza de la Trinidad, who conducted an oral history with Daria in 2016, quote, Daria loved that picture. She was so proud of her role in the strike and adamant that she should be involved. She was such a formidable woman. After the strike, Daria and others led a march from Rio Grande City to the state capitol in Austin to announce their protest before the state government. Along the way, they stopped in small towns that dotted the South Texas landscape. Kennedy, Texas was one of those towns, and the strikers apparently made an impression on one of the churches in town. For a half century after the strike, Daria continued to work in the fields. She raised a family, lived a proud life, but material success never came to her. As she settled into a modest life, Marcella said that her mother basically lived in poverty. She said her house was almost unlivable, but Pastor Martinez from the church in Kennedy, a town they visited on the 1966 march, came just a few years ago. With others from their church, they built my mother a new house. Unfortunately, COVID-19 took Daria, but not before she cemented her legacy as a woman of historical importance. Professor de la Trinidad, who bore witness to Daria's life through the oral history process, said Daria saw herself as the mother of the community, and through her activism, she also became one of the people who would launch the civil rights movement in South Texas. Que en paz descanse, Daria Vera. Rest in peace. Okay, I'd like to turn to my conversation for today, and I'm really pleased to have Paul Farber back. We had him on a couple months ago for a brief conversation. Let me introduce him now. Paul M. Farber is director of Monument Lab. He also serves as senior research scholar at the Center for Public Art and Space at the University of Pennsylvania's Weitzman School of Design. Paul's research and curatorial projects include transnational urban history, cultural memory, and creative approaches to civic engagement. He's the author of A Wall of Our Own, An American History of the Berlin Wall, which appeared this year with the University of North Carolina Press. This book tells the untold story of a group of American artists and writers who found refuge along the Berlin Wall and in Cold War Germany in order to confront political divisions back home in the US. He's also the co-editor with Ken Lum of Monument Lab. This is an indispensable book. Monument Lab, Creative Speculations for Philadelphia, appeared with Temple University Press last year. A public art and history handbook designed to generate new critical ways of thinking about and building monuments. He previously served as the inaugural scholar in residence for the Mural Arts Project in Philadelphia. His work on culture has also previously appeared in The Guardian, Museums and Social Issues, Diplomatic History, Art and Public Sphere, Vibe, and on NPR. Paul Farber, thanks for joining us today again on COVID Calls.
Thank you for having me, Scott. It's really great to be back and be in conversation with you again.
So let me start the way that I usually do, which is just to find out where you're calling from and how the pandemic is looking there today.
Yeah, so I'm in Philadelphia, and it's in the moment that the kind of fall where there were more people outside. There was in some cases kind of cautious socially distanced reality, and in other cases not as cautious, getting kind of ready and right in the midst of a new wave of lockdown. So, a number of, I'm in the arts and culture and history world. And so a number of institutions across the city, museums especially, that had worked incredibly hard to open their galleries and find ways to kind of continue programming. Many of them have closed their doors officially, at least through the new year. And as all of us have been pushing to find ways to engage virtually. And, I give a lot of credit to the folks in the sector who've been pulling together from, just really the first days after the pandemic and creating community in ways that hadn't actually existed before the pandemic. So taking no solace in all of the difficulties some of the furloughs affecting museum staff, disproportionately the frontline staff, the education team, which in a lot of cases are, the most diverse and most kind of dedicated to issues of social justice. So recognizing that, and also just appreciating the incredible work to keep culture as vital in the city, really, especially from the artists and artist community here.
And it really resonates. I mean, I talked early on, back in June, I had a number of conversations with researchers and staff and leadership at the Academy of Natural Sciences, which is affiliated with Drexel. They were doing unimaginably creative things to engage the public at that time. It was a rough time because that's a time of year when school groups would be crowding the Academy. And I know that they're exactly as you described, this time of year would be another sort of really busy time for them, welcoming people in. To miss those two moments to engage the public, not to mention day to day, is just really hard.
Yeah, I think I wrote an op-ed very early in the pandemic for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I think the title was something to the effect of "A meteor just hit our arts community in Philadelphia," and at that point, it seems like a lifetime ago, where it seemed like the shutdowns and the pandemic might last a matter of weeks rather than months and or year plus. Something I said then, and I stand by now, that if for some reason we had a holiday or time off from work, you'd see the museums filled and flooded. That's what happens during the holiday season. So, it's absolutely a challenge. One thing I will say is, if you're looking to support museums at this time and you can't go there, almost all of them have shops that you can do holiday shopping at. You can be a part of the both on a big level for your favorite museums, but also the grassroots organizations and museums and even independent artists. Like Monument Lab's store is a way to support us without showing up at an event right now. So there's so many other people who you can show support and solidarity to, even if you're in the habit of usually being in person with them. You can still be in spirit and solidarity.
There's so many things I want to ask you about today, but I want to just start. I wanted to ask you this question first. What was the first monument or memorial that you remember that grabbed your attention? I'm trying to get a little bit of sort of context of where you come from with this work. Do you remember what that might have been, the first time you saw monument, statue, memorial in a city, or maybe not in a city, and thought, wow, that's something I need to know more about?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I have to say, today has been a day where I've been on a little bit of a conversation tour, and I spoke to an undergrad class, college class today, and I spoke to a class of 7th graders, and all of whom are working on monuments. And actually said something. I'll answer your question, but actually go about it in a slightly different way, which is most of the sites that come to mind now for me fade into the background. They were the field trips that you are much more invested in, like the experience around it and the time with your friends, that you're told this thing is important, whether it's a museum, whether it is a statue, but really to find the personal connection is much tougher. And so I think, for me, it was actually really a site that it wasn't because it grabbed me. It's actually a little bit of the opposite. I grew up in Philadelphia in the neighborhood of Mount Airy, and I went to school in Germantown at Germantown Friends. And, you drive kind of every day to school down the cobblestone road of Germantown Avenue, a former Lenape walking trail turned into a colonial road. And the cobblestones, I would ask why we would be there. And it was the sense that somehow they were historical. I didn't understand at the time that that's part of that is as much of a story and a kind of a sensibility as opposed to a pure history. But it was understanding that of all the kind of ways that I imagined life in the neighborhood, there was a pretty ignored site that was George Washington's summer home, the Deshler Morris House on Germantown Avenue. I remember the kind of yellow shutters that were badly painted, and no one could ever go inside. And it kind of struck me. I thought, like, this is a really important site, I would imagine, or as I'm told, but there's no connection to it. There's no vitality to it. And when I look around the neighborhood and I think about expression and creativity, I would hear music playing out of stores and out of cars. I would, see art galleries. I would see all these other vital forms of expression, the way people wore clothing and the way that the community organizers work. And it was that site that I was told was very important that I felt no connection to. So I think, if anything, that really sticks out to me, that there was a little bit of a disconnect for me between what seemed important, or what had the kind of aura of importance, to then what had vitality, what had spark, what had connection to it as well.
Thanks for sharing that. And it's interesting because I grew up in a suburb of Fort Worth, Texas, and I've thought a lot about, just thinking about, I was going to talk to you today, that it was a place that was monumentless. I mean, there was, if you didn't look hard, I mean, there were almost no historical institutions at all. A couple of plaques here and there, and so I was hungry for that. And I remember when I would go to cities as a kid, or roadside attractions, even the flimsiest roadside marker saying something happened here, which in Texas might have been something that happened in the 20th century, I would devour it. But I grew up in a place where the monuments were the freeways. I mean, there was not that. So that experience you described, it must be one, growing up in Philadelphia, that you were really surrounded by attempts to memorialize, attempts to tell you and dictate to you what the history, what the important sites were supposed to be.
Yeah. And, that's a great point. And I was thinking about, in some ways that's a luxury of being in Philadelphia. And also it's a little bit of a kind of challenge that you grow up into, which is where does history live? Who gets to tell it? And how do you make sense of it? And I think, over time, I've understood this kind of fabric woven together of historical memory. There's the prominent sites like Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell and Independence Mall and even City Hall. There are historic markers that tell a slightly more critical take, or at least a collective take. And of course, then there are the kind of unofficial or even grassroots sites, the house museums, the kind of spontaneous forms of memory. I have to say, though, I think over time, on one hand, I was really drawn to the places that I saw people, flocking to. And I feel like it was always seeing the life of people. I think of the Art Museum steps as a place that's really important in so many ways. And in this summer, in a summer of unrest and protest, was a gathering point. And we could, of course, talk more about that site. I think also, though, something I didn't answer in your first question, but again, I'm not sure. It's another way I'm thinking about it is, as a high school student, my first internship I had was at Philadelphia Weekly. And I would take the train downtown, and I was, excited to be able to be in like the middle of the city. And I would come across all these places of, different statues and public art. And I would see, murals that really influenced me. But I had a really vivid experience. It did really stick with me. And I think a lot about it now, where I had never seen the kind of post-industrial landscape of the city. I didn't even know that was the name for it. But I was really aware in that moment that I'm riding the train, and out the front window, you can see the skyline that's glittering. And I knew what was there. But I'm looking out the window in the regional rail, and there are factories that are shuttered, that some of them look like they shuttered a few days ago. Some of them, they look like they were shuttered decades ago. Sometimes there would be trees growing out of them. Sometimes there would be signs of life. It just was wrote a kind of long poem about it and read it at the high school assembly. It stuck with me because it felt, I didn't have the language of unintentional monument, which I would call it now, an unintentional monument to the challenges and failures of progress, of economic stagnation, of lost opportunity. But at that point, I remember, and I have to find that poem. My parents gave it back to me recently in a kind of, speaking of memory, a memory handback. But I remember thinking about this kind of contrast between the historic city I was getting to know better working downtown, of Ben Franklin's city, of William Penn's city, the one that I was told, the city of beneficent statesmen. And then the other side of it, which was the challenges and the failures. And I felt like actually at that point, it wasn't necessarily a disillusionment, though there was a little bit of that. It was more of a kind of hunger to see how the stories of so-called progress and of course challenge were braided together in the city that I was growing up in and loved, but also knew had its own challenges too.
We'll get to COVID, but I want to, if you don't mind, I want to also ask you about this book that you've got just out, A Wall of Our Own, An American History of the Berlin Wall. Anybody who's been to Berlin, of course, is going to want to get their hands on this book. But Berlin also has come to stand in, I think, globally as a site of memory. And even if you don't get a chance to go there, people are conversant with the various sites of memory there, and it's a powerful place to be. And it, as you said, unintentional monument, unintentional memorial. The whole city, to me, feels that way. Tell us a little bit about the book.
Yeah. So, I think just to say, like, the book is a way to understand American history, American culture from the Cold War to the present. And when I set out to do it, it was first a dissertation project before it was a book. I wanted to write 10 different dissertations. I wanted to write about the history of racial injustice in the country. I wanted to think about a queer history. I was, my background was in urban studies, so I was thinking about the life cycles in cities. I wanted to write about contemporary Jewish identity. Like, there's all these things. And I was doing a PhD in American culture, and I had an opportunity to go to Berlin for the summer that I thought would be a critical distance away. I didn't understand it would be a critical distance meshed in. So first thing I found out was I was not original in my meanderings. I'd go to a cafe, finding myself listening to other people, finding themselves, anthropologists, literary scholars, historians. But then that summer, a few different things happened. I saw the work of Jewish American photographer Leonard Fried in the CO Berlin. And an image that he photographed that ended up being the cover of my book was a photograph of a Black American soldier guarding the U.S. Militarized border within Berlin days after the wall went up, while being denied full citizenship rights at home. I saw memorials and monuments, some as big as city blocks, others as small as a cobblestone. And I knew that Berlin is a heavy place. I'm Jewish, and I grew up with a sense of a locus of trauma. I have to say, seeing the scars of the city on the surface was actually more of a relief. It was to kind of notion that the lie wasn't being activated, so to speak. That the truth of pain, the truth of trauma, but also the room for transformation. Because I ran into the stories and even the kind of communities, the multiracial coalitions of expats, of artists, of emigres, and then I saw candidate Obama on the campaign trail, and this was the summer of 2008, and all of this cohered to say, well, I didn't actually leave the United States fully. I'm in the footprint of American power abroad, and the one thing that I could combine all of my different interests in was a project in Berlin, because every artist that I wanted to write about, every writer that I was interested in engaging, had a Berlin story, and I was walking in their footsteps. And the idea for me was that I saw that they were both at home and haunted by Berlin. People like Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, Keith Haring, Shinkichi Tajiri, Leonard Fried, Paul Robeson, Langston Hughes, even the people who didn't have a significant Berlin story, there were these connections to post-World War II Berlin. I think of James Baldwin's letter to Angela Davis, which talks about a visit that he took to Germany. And so all of these different stories, this multiracial coalition, that is what spoke to me. And I think over time, what I've seen with Berlin is that is among the heaviest histories that I can imagine that to bring to bear there. But as I said, the scars of the city live on the surface. And while being there at various points, it's made me think differently about the monument landscape in the United States. I remember having these kind of revelations. Like I remember walking the streets of Berlin, feeling even the afterlife, the legacy of violence, even as sublimated, and I kept thinking, well, the legacy of what we call race riots or civic unrest due to police brutality, generations and generations. I haven't seen that demarcated in cities in ways that are commemorative or healing. I've seen them in the kind of economic fallout of places in Philadelphia, around Broad and Lehigh, and Detroit, and in Washington, D.C., and on the U Street corridor, like all these places that take generations to rebuild and rethink and go through these cycles. So Berlin for me was a place to think. It was not a place to imagine life as easy or just utopic, but it was, as I realized in looking at the stories of so many other critical, as I call them in the book, American Berliners, places where they went to have critical distance. And that for me is kind of what is fascinating. It's Berlin as the site of trauma, and it's also Berlin as a space to vantage the kinds of transformation that's necessary.
Well, I mean, that your observation there that you went to Berlin, I mean, of course, and you're discovering others who've been to Berlin or engaged with German history as a way to then think about American history is profound. And I mean, I'll just share that when I was in Hiroshima, and I come to find out a lot of Americans have this experience. I have a colleague there who teaches at the Peace Institute. And he said, after I spent my first day there, he said, oh, yeah, you went through the American day where you didn't know how to act in Hiroshima. And of course, you go to the A-bomb dome and you go to the Peace Park. It helped me understand myself. It helped me understand American 20th century history. And I studied the atomic bomb, and I'd studied that in great detail. But to physically be there and see the park, see the arrangement of it, even just understand the physical scale of the disaster, and to see the paper cranes, and most profound, the mound that they have there, which is the burial ground of the unidentified victims of August 6, 1945. I needed to see that to then understand that event, but also to understand, frankly, what I still see as the gross inadequacies of American memorial culture. It really made it, and so what you're saying really resonates with me in that regard.
And of course that that's a site outside of the notion of our U.S. borders, but it's a site of American violence.
Exactly.
And I think in the shadow of that, it is true. It calls you to attention. You can, I think, in the tradition of many of the people I mentioned that are in the book, A Wall of Our Own, being outside of U.S. borders gave them gives us a vantage point to understand the history, the complexity of our own country. It's one of the reasons, one of the most challenging parts about the pandemic is the challenge of travel. And that doesn't just have to be international. That's even around in our own cities. I'm a proponent of finding places of belonging and home, but also of being a thoughtful visitor and moving around in ways to learn from other people around you and other sites. So just, thinking about like the moment that you shared, you see yourself and you see yourself as part of a bigger set of systems, and you see where you stand in history. And it kind of can call you to attention, and in addition to kind of reckoning, to inspiration for the work that you do.
So let's, I guess I want to ask you one more thing just before we talk about some of the things you're doing right now with COVID, and that is just around how you understand some of the more recent changes in memorial culture. And, so I visited Little Bighorn battlefield Custer Battlefield in 1991. And at that time, it was just a field, some stones, grass. If you didn't know, the only people who died there were Custer and his cavalry. Flash forward to the 2004, I visit again with my brother and my father. All of a sudden, it's the Cavalry Memorial, but also Native American Memorial is there. I think of the Oklahoma City bombing memorial and museum, of course, coming on board the September 11 memorial and museum. It does seem like the 90s into the early 2000s was an inflection point in terms of merging museums and memorials, and also beginning to expand the we there of who we're remembering at this memorial. Certainly a project that, as we've learned this year, is vastly incomplete, but at least had started by that point. I wonder if because those were years in which you were beginning to first formulate your thinking along these lines. How do you see that moment in time in terms of memorial culture, particularly reflected against where we are now?
Yeah, I think one source I would just recommend for folks who are interested in that specific period too is Erica Doss's book, Memorial Mania, which looks into this kind of boom. And I think in some ways, when we're talking about monuments or memorials, and I although they are distinct in many taxonomies, I think that they actually blur in terms of how they're utilized. Like there are sites of memorial that are while they're oriented around loss and grief, they're trying to express kind of virtues and visions for a future. And likewise, monuments that may even be brash or loud or heavy-handed, but are actually, when you look at them, you understand the kind of profound grief that either is on or adjacent to the pedestal. So, I mean, I think part of what we look at in the kind of waves of memory in the United States in the early 1980s is, and through the rest of the decade, is a kind of big boom. A lot of scholars have talked about around memory culture, and that comes out of a few different frameworks. That's the profound loss of life in Vietnam, both the 70,000 American soldiers killed and millions of Vietnamese people, and the legacy of that war, and the preparations for the first Vietnam Veterans Memorial on the Mall, among countless others across this country and elsewhere. You have Holocaust survivors starting to pass away, and the kind of insistence of the Shoah Project and the building of the Holocaust Memorial in Washington, D.C. as a place to say, wait a second, we can't take for granted that these stories and also these individuals, the witnesses, will carry the story forward. We have to gather all of these stories. Among other crises, the AIDS crisis, and the kind of radical necessity for protest that matched urgent protests with mourning. I often talk about as urgent memory. Young people dying in public spaces, pointing out the precarity that they could be next, carrying forward a tradition that really, I believe, started in the environmental movement, the notion of the die-in, and has been carried forth in Black Lives Matter protests. So I think of that period anticipating what happens in the 90s too, which is those kind of more affective or even kind of a spirit growing to think about history, both the necessity of telling stories and the ones that are missing actively, and the people that are missing, precipitates other kinds of official projects that get greenlit, that get fundraised. It takes 5 to 10 years to kind of get there. And at the same time, another thing that we're thinking about is really reckoning with who is the we, as you said. And so you have all of these kind of conversations, design competitions, wills to remember that are couched around history, but each of them are really about power and presence in that moment. And so those, that's always what's happening. Anytime you see a monument or memorial being built, you can ask what it represents in the past, but we should always think about what its builders are trying to present in the current moment.
So with that in mind, I want to ask you this, and this will be our segue into COVID-19. We have war memorials aplenty, and memorials, local memorials of all different types, and monuments of all different types. And of course, we have the Confederate memorial inheritance, which I'm sure we'll discuss. We have an absence of what you might call disaster memorials. Now, I define war as disaster, so okay, but Hurricane Katrina, there are a couple. There's some small memorials, but nothing on the scale that you might imagine, given the gravity of the event. Earthquakes. We could go down the list, and of course, relevant to this year, there's no 1918 influenza pandemic memorial. Why are disasters missing in our memorial culture?
Yeah, I think part of what is a challenge is on one hand you have the immediate survivors that are struggling with a sense of moving forward, and then sometimes it's the buildings that survive profound disasters. Other times it's the people, it's community, and so there is a way in which one of the kind of moves first is to really think about the kind of personal survival. I do think, though, there's a question of scale. There are sites in the city of New Orleans, official and unofficial, that are dedicated, for example, to the legacy of Hurricane Katrina. There is an official city memorial. There is a art installation outside of the Montreal Convention Center, I believe called Treehouse, which is the recreation of something that would have been seen across the city, which is small homes, not where they're supposed to be.
Right.
But I think, outside of that, life goes on. The desires for life to go on. So one of the kind of challenges with disaster memorials has to do with scale and scope. There are times where, even a war memorial, there's always a question of scale. It's a kind of tragic mathematics. Is like, how many people does it take to mourn, right? I've seen small town memorials that mourn a dozen people from a town who were lost, and I've seen others that deal with the enormity, tens of thousands of people. So I think in many ways, actually, we'll see memorials that are official, but most of the ways that we remember in urgent, in poetic, in ways that are instructive, is often through the work of artists. And so I think of, whether it's the novelists, the poets, the musicians, the second lines that have animated New Orleans as a way to account for the presence of spirit and the absence of people. I think about all kinds of ways in other disasters. Hurricane Sandy, the work of Zoe Strauss, the Philadelphia photographer. And some of that work, while it might not exist as bronze and marble or historic placard, it gets at the profound, intimate and massive sense of loss. And I think part of, as we're imagining what our monument landscape will look like, and thinking about how to, in broad, in creative and thoughtful ways, kind of bring the spirit of those memory keepers, of the artists, of the historians, of the educators who are able to point out, this is how one life fits into this larger fabric of resilience, of resistance, but of loss as well. I think, if anything, in this country, we are lacking a full reckoning with our past, in ways that can save us for the future, right? And it is oftentimes the work of the artists who are not only seeking our kind of platform for expression, but inviting us to think about our survival in more meaningful, vital, and urgent ways.
But just to stay with this for a second, I want to give credit also to Jacob Steer Williams, who also anticipated my question to you about disasters and pandemics. And just to build off that, because I'm really impressed with this notion of the folkloric, of the artistic, the local, organic, authentic, and that practices can be memorial too. You said the second line, obviously. But there still is something about the National Mall in Washington. I mean, there still is something about privilege of place in
Mhm.
society. And maybe this is just me as a person from the 20th century who still grew up with the idea that when you wanted to find out what American history was really about, you had to make your trip to Washington, D.C. and go to the mall. And there you saw the National Archives, and there you saw the portraits and the statues, and that's how you found out what the national culture was. I think obviously we can dispense with that because it's so um, incomplete, and yet at the same time, should we give up on the idea of the National Mall as a repository for memorial culture?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to quit that idea. I think the National Mall was not envisioned to be a memorial sculpture park. Instead, it really was envisioned, as a kind of open common space. Over time, though, as you know, it's marked a kind of pride of place, of memorial, of monument. But I think over time, it really was the experience of, for me, living in Washington, D.C., spending time at the Lincoln Memorial and seeing, this was before there was a national memorial to Dr. Martin Luther King, seeing on this, despite how grand and powerful that space is, right? It commands with a kind of heavy weight. Seeing the words "I have a dream" inscribed in bronze into the steps, for me, really did it. I realized, for all of the immense power, the immense kind of weight of this history, those words and the footsteps of people who gathered in the name of peace and justice in 1963 bear an imprint today. I think a lot about the kind of the story of AIDS activism on the mall. Mm-hmm. Both the AIDS quilt, which we now think of as a part of Americana, when the Smithsonian had put out a collection several years ago about the kind of 101 objects that define Americana. The AIDS quilt was included in there. A piece of the Berlin Wall was too, which we could talk about. But I also then think about how, in one sense, it was radical to mourn publicly. I also think of some of the more defiant protests happen on the mall or adjacent to the mall. I think about Essex Hemphill, a Black queer poet who lived in part in Philadelphia, who was cautious of the AIDS quilt, said it's too soon to make monuments before we understand the forces of people trying to kill us. So it's also the fact that the White House fence was a place where ACT UP activists would not only gather, but a number of people requested their ashes be thrown over the fence. That's the resting place of a lot of queer activists. And, on top of that, just think about, for all of the ways that we have marked our history and we're a historically conscious nation, there is no national memorial or monument to slavery. Right. In this country. There is now a National Museum of African American History and Culture. That's different. And, imagine going to Germany and there's no Holocaust memorial. Imagine going to South Africa and there's no apartheid memorial. That is federally mandated. That is part of a broad education program. That might be a part of a reparation program as well. I feel like that gives me a sense of the Washington Mall and has allowed me to both kind of appreciate how it has been reinterpreted, reimagined over time, but also that the story of the mall, like the story of our democracy, is one of gaps, gaps between the aspiration and the reality. And so, I think I get asked this question. I get asked a related question, I think, a lot of times, which is like, look, I'm down for us thinking and reckoning with monuments, but do you ever wince when you see a monument coming down? And, I think I try to think about it as like something that all of us have to unhook, but I know I stand in this as well, is that our history has valued white property and people over the lives of Black and Indigenous people over time. And that's reflected intentionally or unintentionally in our monument landscape. And so part of what I think is a challenge to do is to kind of think about some of the very tools that we think are necessary for the telling of history, preservation, archiving, and both democratize the practice, democratize the space, open it up, whether it's the wall or the archives, and also understand that the silences, that the gaps, the erasures are not without the need to reckon with. Like, we actually have to seek them out. We have to both add, and we also have to understand how these stories have been pulled together. And I think the more that we do that, we actually will have more of a path, not just for understanding, but having a more enhanced practice of history, a more enhanced practice of culture, because we're not trying to protect the lie that this is only a country of freedom. It's a country where the people who were architects of freedom and democracy were enslavers. And so, how we have to do better in terms of institutionalizing that. And at the same time, it's a mindset thing, because we all know history does not happen because some dude rolls into town on a horse and looks off into the distance. We don't even go to that kind of statue. If you want to know a history, you don't say, hold on, I'm going to go to the monument and read the plaque.
Yeah.
But how do we adjust our mindsets so that we open up the possibility to make this a more democratic and reflective and therefore healing enterprise?
I want to remind folks that you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm talking to Paul Farber today about memory, memorial, and COVID-19. And I want to just make sure people are aware. There's a really nice profile written by Hua Su in the New Yorker, came out in September, and I've linked that up on Twitter. And in the piece, the journalist talks about talking to you and your collaborator at Monument Lab, Kin Lum, and about this year. And there's this moment in which it's sort of revealed, like you had your, of course, antenna up for memorial practice in the moment, and you start noticing that statues around the world are wearing masks. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So last March, early March, I'd spent a weekend in Pittsburgh, and it was hard to find hand sanitizer. There was a story that there were, the coronavirus was coming. I got some hand sanitizer at the airport. I used it every time I opened up a doorknob. I sat there with, some colleagues, including dear mentor Kirk Savage, scholar of monuments, and came back to Philadelphia. And within a few days, what I had basically, in my own schedule on the work of Monument Lab, we had programs all around the country for the rest of the spring and summer. And everything was postponed and shuttered. I had my Berlin Wall book was coming out on March 13th. And so we did the book launch with my puppy in the house. And things were happening really fast, and we were figuring out what to do. And I had a conversation with Dr. Patricia Kim, who's a member of the Monument Lab team. She's now a postdoctoral fellow at NYU, really brilliant art and archaeology historian, especially around critical feminist issues. She and I were talking, and we were talking about the Monument Lab social media. And we're like, what do we do? We've started to see these places like bigger museums. We're not a big museum. We see bigger institutions, bigger museums, people kind of expressing loss, grief, solidarity. But in those very opening moments that, if we dig back, it's like, we're going to get through this. See you next week. Or we're canceling our event this week. We might see you later this month. So we said, what do we do? What are we going to do? And so we started, I remember I had seen an image on NPR of a sculpture festival in Spain that was canceled. And there was a caption said, World Health Organization workers put up a giant face mask on the sculpture. So we just started digging, and we said, let's look at every hotspot in the world. Let's look at Wuhan. Let's look at Lombardy. Let's look. And as we were looking, you could see as the virus's kind of hotspot, so to speak, moved across the world, in places where public space was being shuttered, people were withdrawing from it. Not to mention the supplies for face masks were low. You were seeing these images of statues with face masks. And some of them felt in some way sophomoric, but we kind of looked at the way this was happening, and most of them, were not by institutions at that point. Now I've seen museums kind of do this, but what we sensed was, as people are withdrawing from public space, one of the tasks, both with the tools of public art and social media, was to put masks on statues. And, it was in the history of people, handle statues. People have protested, people put signs on them, people have thrown their own blood, thrown red paint.
Sure.
So if you think about that as the legacy of monuments, what's happening here, and what we argued in our piece, Masked Monuments, Parting Gifts for Public Space, that was on the Monument Lab bulletin, was this idea that actually this was not just about a kind of individual take or a kind of prank. This was about the health of the body politic. So on one hand is a kind of call to wear masks, a kind of demonstration of the need to wear masks, but it was also an indictment of the oftentimes federal systems or other kind of civic infrastructure that failed citizens, right? The kind of urgency in this moment. There's a photograph in Lombardy, Italy, right in the middle of that kind of profound hotspot, with an image of St. Francis Assisi wearing an N95 mask. And we don't know who did it, but we know the effect. And the effect across the world was to think about public art as a platform for critical engagement. And again, just as it was as much about the kind of need to wear a mask, it wasn't simply a public service announcement. Because of the role that monuments have in a society, they're a constituency unto themselves. They're the places where the living and the dead dwell together. This was really about the body politic in any given place.
So we have that moment in time and those sets of observations that you were making, which I really like this idea. People are absenting themselves from public space, but the discussion or the argument is not absent. It's being played out in the reinterpretation of these monuments. And then Breonna Taylor and George Floyd are murdered, and the United States, there's protests in the street. So the streets which had been empty are now full. Layer that in terms of your own thinking at that moment, a person who's spent your career thinking about monuments, as you said earlier, not as just a way we understand history, in fact, not a great way to learn history, but actually as statements about politics in the now.
Yeah. So, throughout the pandemic months, we had been at Monument Lab preparing for socially distanced engagements, like our field trip project that we had started in those months beforehand, that we wanted, we were hearing from parents and from caretakers and teachers who were really trying to imagine in the summer, if people were going to go outside, what are socially distanced ways to kind of learn and engage, And then, of course, the re-eruption of unrest after the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and of George Floyd, and countless other Black and brown people in this country that again set a re-eruption of in this movement against systemic racism and state violence. And monuments, are not just among the kind of places where people are gathering, and because they're in town squares and city halls and outside of police buildings and the like, but of course, this is a moment where we heard the tremors a few years ago and the takedowns of several Confederate monuments and the kind of growing notions of either decolonizing or pushing cities to remove really obviously racist caricatures, that they become the lightning rods. And so I think, I can think about a number of things, and I remember this kind of moments of watching in Philadelphia, at least, the art museum was a gathering place where so many people filled the space of the art museum and occupied it and layered it, right, with this meaningful sense of protest. And then, of course, the Frank Rizzo statue and later the Columbus statue for two very different reasons. And I think, in large part, I wouldn't say I was 100% surprised by those moments. The city had announced in 2017 that the Rizzo statue had to go. And the mayor had made a number of announcements over the years, acknowledging that and pushing it down the road. I wrote a Inquirer op-ed in November or December of 2019, asking why we were bungling the history, why we were bungling this kind of next chapter for our city. So I wasn't that surprised. I think some of the things, though, that changed, which are really interesting, is that after the unrest initially, and I got, people reached out to me and said, like, you might live stream the takedown of it. I think this thing might come down in terms of Frank Rizzo statue. Was that among the first images the day after the first big protests in Philadelphia, and then the unrest that happened after that, was the city sent people to clean MSB Plaza, including the Rizzo statue, and did that before they cleaned up neighborhoods, especially 52nd Street in West Philadelphia. Right. And I think that was a moment where, the city had said that, like, it's too difficult to move this thing, and within a few hours it was gone. So, just to kind of say overall, I think that monuments are the kind of tip of the iceberg when it comes to power in a city and in a country. I understand why people protest near them, or people express themselves near it, or even people try to topple or reimagine them, through these kind of intense actions. It's because it's really hard to navigate systems of power to make change. But monuments were put out there in the first place not because they equal power, equal history. They were always argumentative claims by people in power looking to extend their power. Mm-hmm. And so, in a way, it's actually up for grabs, I think also, just the last thing I want to say about this for now, though, I'm happy to go forward, but just to pause, is that of the monuments that were removed over the summer in this moment of reckoning, I think one of the words of the year is topple. I'm going to name my next book Topple, because I'm just fascinated by the word, fascinated by the idea. But the large majority of monuments that were removed over the summer were done by local municipalities and by ordinances. And so what does it mean that the headlines that we see in the newspaper or the prominent images are of the takedowns? And on the other hand, the majority of those monuments that are taken down were either because activists made that possible, or because local cities said enough is enough, we got to do it. I spoke to U.S. mayors over the summer. I spoke to city council people all over the country. But of course, our people are the activists and organizers. And I think I think that gives a little bit of insight of why people go to monuments as a way to reckon with systems of power. It's much harder to go to the seats of power than it is to go to your town square to amplify your voice and make your presence felt.
So, and I like how you stage that. I mean, the idea that Confederate memorial that Robert E. Lee needs to come down it's not a new idea. I mean, there have been people who have been fighting for that for an awfully long time. And certainly from 2017 on, it's been a pretty steady drumbeat. But I'm just going to ask you a question I've been asked as a historian. Well, once we start doing that, what's next? I mean, is Jefferson coming down? Is Washington coming down? I mean, if we're talking about slave ownership, and we're reckoning with that past, how can we possibly? I mean, Benjamin Franklin allowed the trading of slaves out of his office on Market Street. On High Street. So where's the end of that? And I know that question, I ask it in that way because that's how I'm often asked, which is to say, once you open this Pandora's box of reinterpreting these memorials and monuments, you'll never stop. When will you ever be satisfied?
Yeah. We need a full reckoning with our history. And I think that is a pathway, whether that's, through public testimony or studies, or maybe it's not going to happen from the federal government. So we as educators, as organizers, have to do it ourselves. But I think I ask the question, or I think about the question in a different way. Like, rather than what's next, is anything sacred? Like, well, yeah, what's sacred is the life of people in this country, and the inability to acknowledge the systems of racism, of exploitation as part of the nation's history. You can, I think about, like, in the tradition of James Baldwin, you can love a place enough to critique it and critically engage it. And so I know that we have the capacity to have critical, complex conversations, but I know they're difficult. Ben Franklin, late in his life, was an abolitionist, but for the majority of his life, was an enslaver. His Pennsylvania Gazette printed what we call runaway slave ads. And so how do we think about that, right? In a city that has Benjamin Franklin statues all over the place, and a parkway and a high school.
Everywhere.
I think maybe another way to answer it is, if we don't have the conversation, you get to a point where you feel like there is an impasse, where it's either it stays or it goes. And so, there are people across this city in Philadelphia and across our country, and frankly, of course, across the world, who have been innovating this field of memory work. And I'd say ask them, ask the communities who've been deeply affected. Find out ways that, big and small, that we can add to a fuller history. Because I think if you say, but where does it stop? Or what if you open Pandora's box? And I know you're repeating the way that people ask you. What you're also saying is, I'd rather stick my head in the sand and pretend that the history is not as complex, that we don't need to address historic wounds and ongoing legacies of injustice. I'm fine with the way it is. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's necessarily where people are trying to go, though some are. I think some people staunchly do not want to have the conversation because it might question their power. Truly, power is not some kind of static thing. It doesn't live in any one monument. It's in the ability to kind of create space and opportunity and vitality for people. So I think we should have the conversation. I'm thinking about editorial cartoon by Signe Wilkinson in over the summer. It was a picture of William Penn looking down from the top of City Hall saying, "Don't look up here, don't look up here." Mm. And so I'm looking for city thought leaders to take on these questions preemptively. And if they don't, we in the field will continue to do so, trying to find productive, but also meaningful and thoughtful ways to speak truth to power and to really reckon with the monuments we've inherited and try to imagine what comes next.
Talking to Paul Farber on COVID calls, and we're almost up on time, but I do want to make sure we get to, first of all, congratulations. The Mellon Foundation has said they're going to put $250 million into reimagining, reinterpreting memorials in the United States. And I think Monument Lab received the first of those grants, if I'm not mistaken. That's tremendous. And congrats on that. And this has been a year of great activity for you, even though we've all been locked down and distant and not getting on planes and going to Berlin and Hiroshima and other places. And I want to, the last time I had you on, you were just about to go to an art installation that Monument Lab was engaged with that you put on. Tell us about that. I've got a couple of photographs up here, and maybe you can interpret a little bit about what we're seeing.
Yeah, so I'm a part of a collective in Philadelphia called Cleanse 215, and it includes Michelle Angela Ortiz, Lori Wasilchuk, Ricardo Rivera, and Michelle Barbary of Clip Collective. And we've worked in a few different times over the last year to think about sites or stories of conflict, of contest, of struggle, and try to bring light in the form of projection and an artwork to the situation. We, a month after the former mural to Frank Rizzo was removed from the kind of 9th and Montrose wall, we projected onto it as the first group to add new stories to that space, especially from artists featuring workers of color in the market, family stories, And so we wanted to do something related to COVID. We wanted to model a COVID memorial. Not to say this is the only form it would take, but we wanted to kind of, for ourselves and for people who might see this, especially online, to make sure that we don't just let time pass, let the loss of life that's catastrophic pass. We wanted to find ways to mark the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and systemic racism and do so in public space. And so we gathered together at Bartram's Garden at the bandstand. This was not an event like we normally do where we try to drive as many people to it as possible. It was really a small, sparse group, but so many people can see it online and it becomes an archive and it becomes a reference point. And so what we tried to do is both include the work of several artists who have been documenting the life of protest and life of frontline workers, and also put a series of messages on a kind of large scale face mask that we can think about as touch tones. And the image that you have up here, I think a lot about. 222,000 plus Americans died. When we wrote that, we put the plus sign. It's a sad state that we are facing such profound catastrophic loss. And as you said at the top of the show, we are at a point, I believe 275,000 confirmed Americans have died, though I've read reports that those are conservative numbers. That is an immense amount of loss. So, how do you measure that? Sometimes you measure it with the obituary that you read at the top of the show, Faces of COVID-19 on Twitter. I pause on it every time. So I think this was another attempt as a group of artists in a city that, by the way, has no official public art office. It was cut in June, to think about what we can do to shift mindsets and also create spaces of cleansing, of healing, by bringing these kind of messages out into public space.
So this is projected, and the first picture is a little harder to tell, but you got the mask motif here, and you're projecting this. And there were multiple, people can check this out on your Instagram page, and I'll put the link up to that. So we have those two, we have sort of a textual intervention, and then this one, which is just tremendous.
Yeah, I mean, the group, the Cleanse group is an amazing group that have really just like jumped into action. And I think part of what is important and in this moment is that we have to, on one hand, shift as much as we have to in order to keep creating, in order to create messaging, but we also have to do the things that we do. Toni Morrison said, in times of crisis, artists get to work. And so every artist that I know, whether they work in or outside of an institution, already was working from a point of view of urgency and amped that up throughout the pandemic, whether that was making face masks, whether that was, organizing mutual aid, whether that was thinking about ways to fundraise or activate, modes of resistance. So, it's just, again, I think in this moment that we're in now, this long moment, how art is a part of our conversation. It will be both a path forward and a way to reflect on what is behind us. And I think if anything, modeling and speculating on like a COVID memorial, I hope, as you mentioned, that there are no prominent, 1918 influenza memorials. More soldiers died of influenza in World War I than they did in combat, but they coincided, and people didn't memorialize the pandemic, and we are learning some of the same lessons over and over again now. So hopefully these kind of projects, though they're temporary, they linger in the insistence to remember as a way to move forward.
I've kept you too long. I told you I was going to keep you a couple of minutes after 6, and we're almost a quarter past. So I don't want to take too much more of your time. Maybe you can just tell us 15 seconds what your first project is going to be with this Mellon Foundation work.
Yeah, so we are really grateful for this support to be the inaugural grantees of the Monuments Project. We're especially excited because there's going to be a whole field of other people, colleagues, collaborators, partners who over the next 5 years will be funded. And you can tune in next Wednesday night I'm part of a dialogue hosted by the Mellon Foundation president, Elizabeth Alexander. It's at 5 p.m. next Wednesday about the Monuments Project. And the first thing that we are doing as Monument Lab, we're doing a national monument audit. We have an amazing team with Lori Allen, Sue Mobley, Brian Fu, and a team of researchers across the country who are gathering every data set that we can find on monuments and pulling them together and having them fit together in ways to offer a kind of full view of the monuments that we've inherited. And by the way, the monument data sets have big holes in them, right? Mm-hmm. Different states track them in different ways, but in early part of spring, we'll release it in the way that we like to, right? We're artists, so there will be a publication, there will be a data set, but lots of opportunity to engage, plug in, and we're excited for that. We'll also release in the next few weeks a kind of public call for participation for history professors and communities to imagine how they might help in these efforts. But you can always follow us at monument_lab. Or join one of our mailing lists is the best way to be plugged in. And we're excited to kind of move forward with this stage of our work.
I want to remind everybody, you've been listening to COVID Calls. You can catch COVID Calls every weekday, 5 p.m. Eastern Time, wrapping up another big week tomorrow, the first part of the hour tomorrow. Please do join me. Tomorrow I'll be talking to Terrell Hagler again. You know him as Ya Fave Trash Man. And we'll be talking to him about essential workers and sanitation workers in Philadelphia. And I want to thank Paul Farber. We'll have to have you back. We didn't get through. I have about 10 more questions here. So let's talk again. Your work will be ongoing. And just to say, thank you so much for what you and your colleagues are doing right now. We're not waiting till this disaster is over to figure out what it means. You're helping us work through it in the moment.
Well, thank you. I'm so grateful for this conversation and for all the work that you do, Scott. So I'm glad to come back again. Keep doing what you're doing.
Stay healthy, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow, 5 o'clock.